Okay, I have a lot of ground to cover today, so I don't want to linger. I'm going to touch on some rather important, hopefully interesting topics in this lecture, but I don't want to get off on some tangent like I have a habit of doing. But I'm going to talk about Papua New Guinea and Guadalcanal, and I want to show you how these two areas are related, because I lecture to a lot of Australian audiences, and as well as Americans and Europeans and other nationalities, but especially in Australia. I think when I talk about Papua New Guinea and Australia, they're in the habit of thinking of what happened in Papua New Guinea, especially with the Battle of Coral Sea and then the Japanese attempt to go overland to take Port Moresby as being somehow separate from other things that were going on in the area. And a lot of Americans too, when they think about the Solomon Islands, they think about the Marines who landed on Guadalcanal in the first week of August 1942, and don't even see any connection between that and what was going on in Papua New Guinea about the same time. But as you recall, the Japanese attempted to take Port Moresby, which is down. I know I'm out of camera range, but I can't help it. My pointer doesn't work. So Port Moresby's down there. The Japanese tried to take it in May 1942 by sea. They failed in that attempt, but then they landed their troops just on the north coast of Papua New Guinea, a little village called Buna. It was then that they were going to trek over the Owen Stanley Range and try to take Port Moresby that way. I think they started off somewhere around in June or July to make that attempt, and it's quite a trek over the Owen Stanley Range there. There's only some Australian militia there to try to stop them. They couldn't. Some of them were captured and later executed. The rest of the Australians fought a retreat and tried to slow the Japanese down as much as they can. So by the time we get into, let's see, what was it? It must have been, they were getting very close around August to Port Moresby. Matter of fact, they were within sight of it. They could see the lights in Port Moresby from where they were. But then something happened on their left flank, that left flank being Guadalcanal over here in the Solomons. The Marines had landed there in August, and so the headquarters in Rabaul ordered Major General Horry, who was in overall command of those troops trying to take Port Moresby. He said, halt in place because we have a problem on your left. We're not sure how severe it is. It may just be a distraction, but we're going to go in there and try to see what's going on. They would send in a small battalion or regiment size of Japanese to push what they thought was just a small incursion on the part of the Marines. And in each case, when they went in there to try to push the Marines off, they got wiped out almost to the man. That's why I think it was General Imamura up in Rabaul told Horry to stop because we're not sure what's going on there. Well, by the time they realized that there was more than just a minor Marine Corps incursion, there was an entire division plus part of another one, and they had made an exerted effort to actually take Guadalcanal and hold it. When that became evident, then Imamura ordered Horry to not just halt and go no further. He said, you better retreat back over the Owen Stanley Range because we have a major problem on Guadalcanal. If we cannot kick the Americans off Guadalcanal, then there's no point in taking Port Moresby because then you will be cut off. We will have your whole left flank will be exposed. You get over there, we may not be able to resupply you, and your whole effort will be wasted. So if you read a lot of the books written by Australian historians on the subject, they make it sound as if the Australians themselves had stopped the Japanese and then forced them back over the Owen Stanley Range. But if you look at a lot of the books written by Australian historians, they're using mostly Australian archival material. The historians that access Japanese archival material along with whatever other material, then they get a much different picture of what's going on. And I think one of the best books written about the Kokoda campaign in 1942 is by a friend of mine, Dr. Peter Williams out of Canberra, because he has worked on a book called the Kokoda Campaign 1942, myth and reality. And he has ponied up with the Japanese military historian in accessing Japanese archival material, so he could sort of do the math, compare what the official Australian history says and what the Japanese say. And so he comes up with a much better picture of what happened. So likewise, Americans, when they think about Guadalcanal, they just don't see the relationship of what was going on in Papua New Guinea at that time. Okay. And I only want to mention this because MacArthur, who was prepared to die fighting with his men in the Philippine Islands, but Franklin Roosevelt could not have that happen. So he ordered MacArthur to get to Australia any way he could to take over overall command of Allied forces there. So he elected, he could have left by submarine, but he elected to leave by PT boat, got as far as Mindanao in the Philippines, and then flew B-17 over to Australia, and then took a train from Adelaide down to Melbourne. And he was greeted as a hero before he had even accomplished anything, and he certainly didn't accomplish much when he was in the Philippines. But there were crowds, they saw him as their savior, because most of their troops weren't even there in Australia. Most of their troops were in North Africa and the Middle East fighting for the British Empire, and one entire Australian division, the 8th, was lost in Singapore when that eventually fell. I like this quote from John Curtin, and I think one of the important things about this quote, that this was made before Pearl Harbor. He went on radio, publicly said that, we've been part of the British Empire all these years. We've always come to the aid of Britain during the Boer War, World War I, now World War II. And now when our very survival is at stake, the Empire can't help us. So he went on radio and said that from now on, our best hope of survival is a close relationship with the United States, and it has been ever since. But here again, here's a little bit of a close-up. You can see how close Port Moresby is to Cape York, or the northern Queensland part of Australia. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands are over here to the right. You can see Gona, Sanananda, and Buna, and that's where the Japanese landed and marched overland to an attempt to take Port Moresby. Oops, did I go too far? No, that's all right. But anyway, they landed there in Buna, marched overland, as I told you in an earlier lecture. If you see with the blue arrow, that is Milne Bay. They also landed troops there with the idea of making a sort of a pincer movement. The Australians beat them to there. The Japanese didn't know it, so when their troops landed, they got whacked pretty bad, and survivors, the Japanese Navy had to come in and pull them out. And this is a little bit better map. You can see Buna. You can see the outline of the Kokoda track. Now, the Americans now, when MacArthur got to Australia to take command of Allied forces, he didn't find much. There was some Australian militia. There was the 32nd Infantry Division, which was a nationalized National Guard unit. They had been training for possible war in Europe. They didn't even have the proper equipment. They were wearing khaki instead of jungle green. They didn't even have machetes or entrenching tools. But because Prime Minister Curtin was so desperate for at least a semblance of protection there with all their troops over there in North Africa and the Middle East, Roosevelt, after being requested by Churchill, sent the 32nd Division over there. Later, the 41st Division, which was also a National Guard unit. They decided, MacArthur decided he was going to help the Australians as they were pushing the Japanese or following the Japanese back over the Owen Stanley Range. There was another trail just to the southeast called the Kappa Kappa Track. And he sent the 126th Regiment of the 32nd Division in there with the idea that they would march overland, get behind the retreating Japanese, and help out the Australians that way. Well, the Australians warned the Americans that the Kappa Kappa Track hadn't been used in years, and there wasn't much of a track. So the 126th went in there, and it took them forever to get over there. They were throwing equipment away right and left, and they were a bit of a ragtag army by the time they made it over to the north side of the island. They didn't cut off the Japanese at all. Matter of fact, they were pretty well wrecked by the time they got over there. But you have to remember, too, in Papua New Guinea, there were no roads. It was all tracks, and I mean tracks, trails. So the Japanese knew that. So when they came down and landed on Buna, they also brought in about 20,000 Toliite people from the island of New Britain to act as porters. They would be using to carry food, ammunition, everything the Japanese needed to make their attack on Port Moresby possible. At the same time, the Allies, especially the Australians, made use of some of the local Melanesians. They were called Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. And they were pretty much organized and led by Bert Kienzle, who had lived in Papua New Guinea for a number of years, especially when they found gold up there in the Owen Stanley Range. So everybody that I talked to had fought there or had been wounded or sick. They owed their life. They told me they owed their lives to the Melanesians who helped carry them out of harm's way and back to some field hospitals. But in anticipation of the fact that these Japanese soldiers under Major General Horry were going to have to retreat back over the Owen Stanley Range, some Japanese Army engineers or Marine engineers built defensive positions along the coast, not just in Buna, but also in Sanananda and over in the little Gona mission there. So that's where they were dug in. And the water table was pretty low there. So they really couldn't dig foxholes. Or they could go down for maybe a foot, 18 inches, and that was about it. So what they did, they built defensive position pretty much from the ground up using 55-gallon oil drums filled with rock and dirt and then covered over with coconut logs and dirt. And then they planted fast-growing tropical plants around there to camouflage them. So when the Australians and the Americans, the 32nd Infantry Division, got there, they knew the Japanese there, but they couldn't see them, but the Japanese could see them. So this turned into a bit of a problem for MacArthur, because I think he realized that he was being given a second chance given his performance in the Philippines, and that if he didn't make quick work of these Japanese defensive positions, then he might be relieved of command. And I guess in a moment of weakness, he confessed as much to one of the Australian generals that he was working with. But this is a painting, and it's actually done from an actual photograph of elements of the 32nd Infantry Division trying to reduce the Japanese positions there in Buna. And you can see how well camouflaged their outfits were. Now, their positions were. I mean, you actually had to be on top of them in order to see them. As a result, the Americans and Australians took quite a few casualties. But by this time, too, after about 2 months of fighting, the Japanese were not getting any reinforcements. They were starving to death. They couldn't even bury their dead. They were using their dead to make barricades. They were stacking their dead bodies in front of them as they tried to fight off the Americans and the Australians. It was at this point, too, that a lot of them resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. But after about 2.5 months of fighting, there were very few Japanese left alive in those positions. Now, MacArthur didn't have much of an air force, didn't have much of an army, didn't have much of a navy. They were so desperate to find anything afloat in order to supply their troops in Bona and Gona area that they were actually leasing and buying whatever they could in Australian waters, fishing boats, lighters, you name it. And they were also, and it wasn't the U.S. Navy that put together MacArthur's Navy, it was U.S. Army personnel. I mean, that's how innovative they had to be, because it was a really desperate situation in those early days of the fighting. And they recruited Australians, Aborigines, and Tory Island Melanesians into this U.S. Army Navy, if I can refer to it. And they recruited people who were considered either physically unfit or too old to serve in the regular military. There were even a couple of guys who were amputees who were serving in this small ship Navy. Of course, things improved as the war progressed. He got more ships, he got more soldiers, more airplanes. But in the very early days of the fighting there in Papua New Guinea, it was a pretty rough slog. Now, originally, it was General Harding, who was in command of the 32nd Infantry Division. He was a West Point graduate. He was a friend of George Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff. And actually, General Harding, he said, I requested to take command of this National Guard unit. Well, the National Guard units really didn't have a very good reputation. You know, it was sort of like a weekend warrior sort of thing. They're not as well trained as some of the regular Army units. As a matter of fact, doing a little bit of research on National Guard units that were activated during World War II, not a single one of the reserve commanders of those National Guard units kept their job. They were all fired and replaced with regular Army officers, except for one. And what was his name? His name was General Beitler. I think he was from the Midwest someplace, but I can't remember. But he was somebody who, even though he was a National Guard commander, he studied war. He took his job seriously, I think realizing that at some point they might actually go to war. So he's the only National Guard commander who started off and ended the war still as a commander of a National Guard unit. But Harding was not getting very far. They were trying to get troops overland, but that was pretty slow. They're building an airport, a little airstrip, Dobodura, just outside of Buna, but hadn't been quite completed yet. So they're trying to take small boats and reinforce and resupply his troops. But the Japanese had overall command of the air at that time. So a lot of these efforts to get supplies there by sea were interrupted by strafing Japanese fighters. Matter of fact, he was on a group of ships that were towing barges there. When the Japanese spotted them, they strafed it. They sank a lot of those barges and the boats pulling them and killed a lot of the soldiers on board. Matter of fact, Harding was on one of the boats and he had to swim ashore to get there. But he wasn't making very much progress, but they had little or nothing in the way of mortars, tanks, heavy artillery, and they weren't going to get some for a while. So basically it was looking like a stalemate. MacArthur was getting very nervous. He was afraid if he got bogged down there too long, he would be relieved of command. So he fired General Harding and brought in Eichelberger. Eichelberger had been sent out to the bush in Australia to train troops where journalists couldn't find him. Because earlier, Eichelberger made the mistake of being interviewed by Life magazine, I think it was, and his photograph actually ended up on the cover of Life magazine. And see, MacArthur didn't want to see anybody's photograph on the cover of Life or Time except his. He certainly didn't want any of his lieutenants to get a lot of publicity. Any publicity in his theater of war had to be all about him, not about anybody else. So Eichelberger was sent out to the bush for a while, but when push came to shove and he fired Harding, he grabbed Eichelberger and told him, you get in there and you take Buna or don't come back alive. A little bit of melodrama there. But finally, though, after Eichelberger got there, though, they got the Dobodura airstrip there. They started bringing C-47s. They started getting in more supplies. They brought in some mortars, some field artillery, and they also brought in some light Stuart tanks. That made a difference. But also, by this time, the Japanese were starving. They were not being reinforced. They couldn't get any food in there. They had been reduced in numbers, like I had said just a few minutes ago. So thankfully, given time and given some extra firepower, they finally reduced Buna and Gona. Now, one of the people I had a chance to interview was Richard Watts. He was like an 18-year-old kid. He was in the Australian militia. He was sent to Port Moresby even before Pearl Harbor. But he wasn't there to get any jungle training or to fight. He was there to do manual labor because they were trying to build some of the airstrips there, build up their anti-aircraft defenses. They needed people to offload the ships that were bringing all this material in. So that's exactly what he did until the Japanese entered the war. And when they started marching over the Owen Stanley Range, over the Kokoda Track to take Port Moresby, he had to pick up his gun and be ready to defend Port Moresby. But then, when the Japanese started retreating back over the Kokoda Track, he was sent along to help hurry them along. Eventually, though, Australia started bringing some of their forces back from the Middle East, and the 7th Australian Division, Regular Army, joined in. But he went all the way over the Kokoda track. He was part of the fighting around Gona, but he came down with malaria so bad that they had to finally pull him out of the line and sent him back to Australia. And he says he was so sick, basically, they were sending him home to die because his malaria was so bad. However, he did recover, and if you know anything about malaria, you don't just get it once. You have recurring bouts about it. But he'd been, like a lot of these people that I try to interview, he'd been trying to forget about the war all these years. But one thing he did tell me when I talked to him was that out of his company, and if an Australian Army company is the same as what a U.S. Army company was back then, it was about 100 men. But he said by the time he was pulled off the line and by the time the fighting was over in Gona, he was only one of 6 still alive. So the casualty rates taken on both sides were a bit horrendous. I want to talk a little about some of the innovations that took place in this theater of war under Douglas MacArthur. And it had a lot to do, though, with his new Air Force commander. He'd already gotten rid of 2 of them. General Kinney came in, and General Kinney said, MacArthur, I'm right behind you. I'll build up your Air Force. You can count on me. And he did, but he eventually started getting more aircraft in, B-24s, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs. But they discovered, too, though, that there were things about using an Air Force in a war where there were no big cities and there was a lot of ships involved in the fighting, that, fighting a war like this with aircraft in some theoretical way that they had developed between the wars just wasn't working. So I'm going to talk about some of the innovations that people came up with. One of them was skip bombing, the other one was parafags, and the other one was using A-20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells as gunships. I'll explain this as I go along. One of them is Major William Benn. He was part of the 5th Air Force. He was noticing that trying to drop dumb bombs from altitude on ships 15, 20,000 feet below you didn't work. All you did, for the most part, is blow holes in the ocean, kill a lot of fish. Maybe once in a while you get lucky and hit a ship. So he started experimenting with the idea of coming in low with a 500,000-pound bomb with a delayed action fuse and trying to skip these bombs off the water into the side of a ship. And he practiced this. McKinney found out what he was doing. He says, well, that looks promising. Why don't you keep working on this? And when you come up with something that works, let me know. So basically, that's what, if you're looking there, you've got, I think that's a B-25 Mitchell. You got a 500,000-pound bomb, delayed action fuse. You come in about 50 feet off the deck as fast as you can at a certain distance from your target. You drop your bomb, pull up, and ideally, it'll skip across the water and into the side of the ship. And with the delayed action fuse, the pilot has enough time to get out of the way. It proved pretty effective. And so they started actually putting together squadrons who would then practice that for future operations. Another one was parafrags, because except for maybe places like Rabaul or some larger villages in the area, your targets were small. They were in the jungle. Sometimes they were hard to see. So they came up with the idea of, again, using B-25 Mitchells, other aircraft, a 500,000-pound bomb with a delayed action fuse, and this time a parachute. So you could see a target in the jungle. You come in at 50, 100 feet off the target. You release your bomb. The parachute opens, slows down the bomb, and you have enough time to get out of there before it does any damage. This is a little bit more involved. This is about Pappy Gunn. He grew up somewhere in Mississippi or Arkansas. His father died under mysterious circumstances when he was a teenager. He didn't go, I don't think he even attended high school, but he had to help out his mother and his siblings. He was a natural-born mechanic. He really liked mechanical things, cars. He wanted a car, but he couldn't afford to buy one, so he'd go to a junkyard, and he built his own car out of spare parts. And it was really hot. And these are the days of moonshine. And these moonshiners would hire him to deliver their illicit product. So that's how he supported his family, is by delivering illegal liquor to wherever the moonshiners wanted to send it. But then eventually he got caught. And he went before the judge. And in those days, I guess the judges gave young guys an option. He says, well, I can send you to reform school, or I can send you to the Army or the Navy. He was 17 years old. He had World War I was just about World War I is in process. The United States was just about ready to enter. He went in the United States Navy. They had a new rating. It was called Aviation Machinist Mate, because aviation was being used in World War I. And so he did, with his mechanical ability, he did really well as an aviation machinist mate. And he decided he liked the Navy, and he could send part of his paycheck home to his mother and siblings on top of that. And so he elected to re-enlist. And in those days, they had enlisted pilots. So he became an enlisted pilot, and with his background in mechanics, that was really useful, because not only could he fly a plane, he could repair it. So he stayed in and retired after 20 years. That was be somewhere around 1937. And then he was hired to go to the Philippines with his family. By this time, he was married, had 5 kids. He went to the Philippines to help set up a Philippine Airlines. Then the war started. He was recalled to active duty, but not this time into the Navy, but into the U.S. Army Air Force there. And he was busy flying people in and out and doing all sorts of stuff when the Japanese landed on Luzon, and without telling anybody else, MacArthur declared Manila an open city. So, like I told you in yesterday's lecture, Admiral Tommy Hart, he had to get on a submarine and get the hell out of there, because he'd already sent most of his fleet away from Manila as it was. So before he could even find his family and rescue them, they had already been captured. Now, there was a place in Manila called Santa Thomas, and they turned that, I don't know if it was a university or what it was, but anyway, they turned that into a civilian internment camp. So all the civilians that were trapped in the Philippines were sent there for the duration of the war. Very few of them were Navy personnel, because if you remember from a previous lecture, I said Admiral Tommy Hart was so convinced that war would start at any time that even a year before Pearl Harbor, he ordered all Navy dependents sent home. Hart was not very popular with the officers or their families at that time, but after the Japanese invaded the Philippines, they had a completely different appreciation for what Admiral Hart had done. Well, one of his sons wrote a book about his father after the war, and he said his father was so upset for the fact that he was kept so busy doing military stuff that he didn't take the time to rescue his family and get them out of there, because he had a wife and 5 kids that were locked up in Santa Thomas. His son said he spent the rest of the war working desperately in any way he could to help MacArthur returned to the Philippines with the idea of not just liberating the Philippines, but liberating his family. His son said he would work until he couldn't keep his eyes open anymore. And then he would take a quick nap and go back to work. And he came up with an idea similar to Major Brennan. He realized that some of these planes were just not being used very effectively the way they thought they would be. So he started experimenting with A-20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells. In the case of the B-25, he took the bombardier out of the nose and packed it full of 50 caliber machine guns, maybe a dozen of them, maybe even 1 or 2 on the outside. And his idea was, instead of using them to bomb ships from altitude, is to go in low, the way they were using skip bombing, and use these things as gunships and literally just shoot up planes from right off the water. So he developed this. He tried to perfect it, but he needed planes so he could just have 1 or 2 like this. He found an airfield with some B-25 Mitchells that were supposed to be part of Lend-Lease to the Dutch, who managed to escape out of the Dutch East Indies. Those were their planes, but he didn't see any Dutch around, so he got a bunch of pilots and stole them and turned them into gunships. And somewhere during the process, he broke a finger. They put it in a splint, but it slowed him down. He couldn't do any work, so he went to a doctor. He says, cut my finger off because I can't get anything done with it in a cast. And the doctor says, it's a perfectly good finger. I'm not going to amputate it. So he took out his .45 caliber, says, either cut it off or I'll shoot the goddamn thing off. The doctor cut it off. He did not want anything, not even a broken finger, to slow him down. Okay, so this all came to fruition in March 1943. The Japanese had been pushed out of Buna and Gona. They were retreating up the north coast of Papua New Guinea. They were up in the area of Lae. I'll have to show you that on a map later. But the Japanese in Rabaul were trying to reinforce them. Well, this time of year, there's a lot of cloud cover over the off the north coast of New Britain, but the southern coast was exposed to sunshine. So the Japanese put together a task force of troop transports with reinforcements and all their supplies, and they were being escorted by destroyers over the north coast of New Britain in the Bismarck Sea. Okay, well, the code breakers knew what was going on. Well, they couldn't attack when they were under the cloud cover. But once they got around the west end of New Britain, near the Vitesse Straits, all of a sudden there's no more cloud cover, and the B-25s and the A-20s had been converted for skip bombing and converted into gunships. They pounced. They sank all of the troop transports, some of the destroyers. Very few of those Japanese reinforcements ever made it to Lae. And it's all because of people like Pappy Gunn and Major Bren when they had developed these new ways of using aircraft to win the war. Now, of course, MacArthur eventually made it back to the Philippines. Before they got there on the island of Palawan, I think it was, the Japanese saw the Allied fleet coming in. They had a group of Allied POWs there, including Admiral Kimmel's son, who was a submariner. And they put them in a trench that was covered with wood, poured gasoline over it, set it on fire, and then machine gun anybody who tried to get out. When we found out about that, we were concerned about the civilian internees at Santo Tomas in Manila and some of the other POW camps where they still had Allied POWs, mostly American, there in the Philippines. So they put together a number of plans to try to rescue these POWs as well as these civilian interns in Santo Tomas. And in the case of Santo Tomas, what they did is they put together a flying column of tanks and armored vehicles, and they raced through Manila until they got to Santo Tomas, and they held the Japanese off there until reinforcements could come. And it was only then that Pappy Gunn knew that his family was still alive. Up until that point, he had no idea if his wife or 5 children. So that had a happy ending, but he worked awful hard to help MacArthur get there. Now, okay, so MacArthur, okay, he's in good stead now. He finally reduced the Japanese at Buna and Gona. They're pushing the Japanese up. You can see Lae there in the corner near the Huon Peninsula. And things are starting to move a little bit better. The Australians are inland, pushing the Japanese up from the inland. MacArthur is using amphibious forces to leapfrog up along the coast of Papua New Guinea. But they were concerned too that the Japanese occupying New Britain, they're going to have to secure this area around the Vitesse and the Dampier Straits. So they sent in the 1st Marine Division to Cape Gloucester to keep the Japanese from interrupting MacArthur's efforts to get back to the Philippines. Now, it was the 1st Marine Division who went into Guadalcanal. After being relieved there, they had some pretty happy times in Australia after that. But then the happy times ended. They had to go back to the war, and that was their next landing there at Cape Gloucester. I'm getting towards the end of it. I'm doing pretty good here. I thought I would be a bit rushed, but I just never know until I get to the end, really. But so here we are. We're getting into May and June of 1944, okay? Now, my next lecture is going to cover more of this. But MacArthur is slowly working his way up here. By May, he's landed on Biak Island, there right where you see that line. A week later, the Allies land in Normandy. A week after that, the Marines land up in Saipan. And after the Marianas were taken, then General Tojo and his entire cabinet had to resign. So I'm going to go more into that in tomorrow's lecture. I'm not sure what time it is. And since there's still a few minutes left, I wanted to put that back up on the screen. So like I told you, I'm uploading all my lectures onto YouTube, and by the end of the cruise, hopefully they'll all be there. But that's what you can click on if you want to take a photograph of that, if you didn't already. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow.